Hello everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar tonight. We want to get started at 6:30 on the dot, so hopefully you're starting to join us now. My name's Amanda McKenzie. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council, and I'm here with Greg Mullins, that you're probably very familiar with now, who's a climate councillor but also former fire commissioner in New South Wales. So we wanted to do a webinar tonight to connect with you on this terrible bushfire crisis and make sure that everyone is informed as to the impacts of climate change. But firstly, I wanted to do an acknowledgement of country and begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're chatting today, and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging, and also extend our respect to traditional owners where you are, and the owners of the land that you're joining us on today. So I mentioned we're holding the webinar to make sure our community is informed. As you probably know, the Climate Council has been doing a lot of work on bushfires over the last 6 or 7 years. We've published 12 publications on bushfires, each warning about how climate change is intensifying bushfire conditions. And unfortunately, of course, this bushfire season, we've seen the consequences of climate change made very clear for all of us. And of course, the crisis is still unfolding as we're speaking today. People have lost their lives, people have lost loved ones, they've lost homes, livelihoods. And of course, we've seen huge areas of our national heritage destroyed. Just thinking about the Blue Mountains, 80% of that national park is being razed. And of course, huge, countless numbers of wildlife has been killed as well. So it's absolutely terrible. I know there's a range of emotions that we're feeling, whether it's feeling very sad or whether, I know I've felt very frustrated and angry for the lack of action on climate change, but also felt quite determined about what this is going to take, and it's going to be so critical for us all to come together. So the webinar tonight, we're going to ask Greg a few questions first about the nature of the fire crisis and get him to do a bit of an unpacking for us. Then I'm going to go into a range of different top questions that have been coming up over the last few weeks, and then get into your questions that you've emailed us. So we received over 200 emails, and we've tried to pull out the ones that are quite representative of where people are at. But before I get into the questions for Greg, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that the Climate Council have been doing over the last few months. So we've published reports leading into the bushfire season about the scale of the, I suppose, looking at the threat that bushfire would pose over the summer. We've done a whole lot of media work. We've been working with Greg and the other fire chiefs to ensure that their voices are out there in the media, as well as working with a whole range of other voices, bushfire survivors, vets, health professionals that are looking at air quality. So trying to cover the whole series of issues around climate change to make sure climate change is at the core of the discussion that's being had on these fires as it's been going forward. I think it's really critical that we continue to do that work and putting climate change right in the centre of the debate. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Amanda.
And we might just get straight into some questions. The first one is, we'd love you to tell us a little bit about your role on the ground. As you may know, Greg's been fighting fires in the last couple of months, and I'd love to know a bit about that work and how it's been different to other fire seasons.
Sure. Well, my firefighting background goes back to 1971, which was when I fought my first big fire with my dad up in the Terry Hills where I grew up. I became a volunteer firefighter the next year, and then a career firefighter in 1978. 39 years later, retired as commissioner, went straight back to Terry Hills Rural Fire Brigade with my dad, who was a life member. And look, so over that time, I've fought fires in the Blue Mountains multiple times, 1977, 1994, 2001, major fires all over New South Wales. I've fought fires in California. I've studied bushfire fighting in Spain, France, Canada. And so I've got a pretty good handle on how things work. And that was one of the bases for trying to warn the government earlier this year, but that's another question. So, look, I've been out again. Our fire season in New South Wales started people say 2 months early in August. It's not 2 months early anymore. I hate to tell you, this is normal now. This is our new normal. I hate saying new normal because people might get complacent about that. This is an absolute tragedy and it's extremely alarming, and all of us should be really, really, really worried. But every August, first week in August, we now get major bushfires. We were losing homes in August. I started fighting fires around September, I think. We had some fires in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park that are close to home, but I went up to Grafton. Fires that took out Rapville, places like Rapville up past Casino. I had a 5-day deployment up there. What amazed me, so that was October, and I was seeing areas where there were no canopies on the trees whatsoever. The intensity of those fires, and talking to the locals about the wind-driven fires. So we'll talk about fuel later, but it's actually a side issue. The fuel is a side issue. These have been weather-driven events, extreme weather. And as you know, Amanda, we've broken so many weather records, so many forest fire danger index records. It's incredible. I've watched this for 50 odd years and I've studied this and I know this area. I would have thought it would be impossible to break so many fire danger index records, but we keep doing it. Fire behaviour, pyroconvective activity. That was a bit like, when I was a kid, my dad talked about the 1939 bushfires and about lightning coming out of the smoke plumes. And it was a bit like, talking about the Yeti. And it was this legendary thing. And I've seen it a couple of times over the decades. But now you see it on just about every bad day where there's extreme and catastrophic fire danger. So it's a big change. But look, things I saw that... down in Bateman's Bay, I was there all day on New Year's Eve and we just lost so many homes, and I've been in that position before and it's extremely distressing. But what really got to me, we were up on the highway past the bridge in Bateman's Bay to the south heading towards Mogo, and I saw kangaroos come out of the bush basically on fire and then just die. And look, that... I couldn't believe that, because the fast animals usually know where to go, and you often see huge mobs of kangaroos, wallabies bounding past. They know where to go for safety. And what that said to me, you had area ignition, so you had thousands of spot fires would start in a particular area, might be over 10, 20, 50 hectares, all goes up at once. And that's what leads to the pyroconvective activity, that incredible heat load going up. That's why there's no canopies left on these enormous trees, and that's why you can't protect the properties, because the fire behaviour was so intense. Even animals who know what to do in a fire couldn't get away. And as we know, quite a number of people lost their lives that day too. And some colleagues of mine from the Northern Beaches RFS had to pull out of Nelligent because they just knew, as they saw the fire coming, if they stayed, they probably wouldn't have made it. And so just incredible fire activity.
Greg, can you tell us a little bit about how climate change is exacerbating these conditions? You've sort of touched on a little bit.
Yeah, so look, I grew up learning bushcraft from Dad, and so he was a volunteer firefighter, but he'd lived in the bush as a kid. And, during World War II in the Air Force, they'd been sent out to fight fires in the Blue Mountains in 1944. He knew his bushfires. He was a volunteer from the mid-50s. So he'd sit me down and say, look, if that wattle comes out early, it's probably going to be, it's because it's dry, it's probably going to be a bad year. If these beetles come early, all these signs. And in the 90s, after the 1994 fires, neither he nor I saw those fires coming. It sort of took us by surprise. And years later, he said, I just can't pick this anymore. Something's really wrong. After the 01-02 fires, Canberra in 2003. So I really started reading a lot in the 90s, and there were some scientists back then saying, yeah, this is coming our way. This is what it's going to do to bushfire behaviour. And look, in a nutshell, what's happened? Huge reduction in winter rainfall. So 15 to 20% reduction May to June. What that does is we used to do most of our burning in July, August. It'd start to dry out in August. Into spring, we'd do hazard reduction burning, because there was still a bit of moisture under the leaf litter, so you could get a fairly mild fire go through. You can't anymore because of that drying out. Our window for hazard reduction is so much smaller, but still there's hazard reduction going on. That's another story. I think we're talking about that later. But that's made it difficult. But that incredible drying over 20 years, and it compounds. That's why we're getting fire seasons starting in August every year, because we do get westerly winds, but now it's warmer and much drier. We're getting far more ignitions from lightning. Now, there's a bit of research on this, and they're not sure whether it's because the bush is drier, so when lightning strikes, it's more likely to set it alight, or whether it's actually more lightning. Now, in Tasmania, it's certainly much more likely. They veteran foresters and firefighters down there saying we never used to get lightning-caused fires at all. But in 2016, they had thousands of ignitions in World Heritage areas that shouldn't burn because they're too wet. 2018, and now they're getting fires again on the east coast. But so there's trends all over Australia. Queensland, New South Wales, there's wet rainforest burning, and areas that have never experienced fire before. And we'd look at the wet areas on maps and say, well, that's a control line. We don't need to do anything. The fire will get there and go out. Well, not anymore. You're getting, as you saw up near Dorrigo, west of Mackay.
You can't believe that those areas would burn, really.
And they're burnt before in a mild way, just creeping fires, but they're burning intensely, taking out the crowns. And a lot of those trees won't ever grow back.
Tell us a little bit about that. So when a fire burns, and you see this on the news, that it almost looks like matchsticks going up. They're huge trees. How is that different to fires you've seen in the past?
So great question, because this goes to fire frequency. So what I've learned growing up, with Dad and speaking to naturalists and doing a bit of TAFE study, etc., and then with climate scientists, you have fire regimes. So each area has a certain fire regime, and it's because over millions of years the weather's got into a pattern, and there's certain times of the year that you get naturally caused fires, or the indigenous owners for 60,000 years would burn at certain times. So the bush adapts to that. So you have flowering plants, take 3 to 7 years to produce seeds, a lot of them. And if you burn within that time, the seed stocks in the soil will be exhausted after about 3 burns, and they'll never come back. So there's things like that. There's Banksias that need smoke and fire to open up their seed pods. But what's happening now, one of the things that really struck me, I was fighting fires in the Blue Mountains, and I know that area so well. I was hazard reduction officer up there in the late 80s, early 90s, and we had that fire, the Gospers Mountain fire, go through Bilpin, take out a lot of homes, the Currajong area, Hawkesbury area. It burnt 6 years ago, the State Mine Fire. People might remember 2013, we had 3 major fires in the mountains. There was one that went from Lithgow, from the military area, right through to Richmond almost. And people saying at the time, this won't burn for decades. Look at it, it's just so scorched. But it's burnt 6 years later, incredibly intensely again. So that's an area that probably shouldn't have fire anywhere between anything less than about 11 years, 13 years frequency, because that's been the frequency in the past. So 6 years, and this is happening throughout the mountains. 2013, as I said, fire at Mount Victoria, the Grace Valley, down at Winmalee, lots and lots of homes burned. When there was no El Nino, that's another canary in the coal mine, and that was in October, when we shouldn't have had property destroying bushfires at all, because we haven't in the past until then. But so the fire regimes are getting mixed up with more frequent fire, and some climate scientists are saying this will change our biology. It will, a lot of the trees will die, they'll become scrublands, scrublands will become grasslands, grasslands will become desert, and then what sucks the CO2 out of the atmosphere when we lose the trees?
It's a very scary scenario, isn't it? Greg, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing with the emergency leaders for climate action? So you may have heard in the media, Greg and his colleagues coming and warning the government back in April last year and then doing a whole series of interventions since that time. Can you tell us a little bit about why you convened the Emergency Leaders Group and then what its activity has been leading up to the fire season?
Sure. Well, Amanda, as you know, we had long discussions about this, and I was really worried about the effect of bushfires on the environment, on people, on the planet. They're becoming far more frequent. Bushfire seasons are now longer. We have far more days of very high fire danger and above each year. So it's getting more and more extreme. What I found talking to former fire chief colleagues was they were all similarly concerned. And so I raised with a couple of them, what do you think we should take action? And the overwhelming answer was yes. Yeah. And it was quite a diverse group of people with different political views. And but everyone left their personal politics at the door and just said, look, we have to speak up. There's an opportunity now to try, maybe we can influence the government, but we must warn.
And that's just grown since that time, hasn't it?
It has. So we had 23, including me, former fire and SES and forestry and national parks chiefs. So every urban and rural fire service in Australia, ex-chiefs or deputy chiefs, most state emergency services, forestry, parks, fire units. There was 23, there's now 31 and might be 32 after a phone call I had this afternoon. So former chiefs are rallying to the cause, coming to the flag saying we must speak out. And it's a really uncomfortable place for a former senior public servant to actually come out and be seen to be criticising the government. It's not a comfortable place. And a lot of us, when we retired, thought, well, that's the end of our public life, because it was pretty exhausting. That we just feel morally, we do have a moral duty as public safety professionals to say, here's what we see, here's some things you could do. And we're ignored. So we tried from April, I wrote 3 letters and an email to the Prime Minister. I got one reply months later saying I'm too busy, you can meet with this other minister who was the wrong minister. Asked that minister to help get someone else to the meeting and he refused. So we finally had a meeting and then we were fobbed off and told things like using the military was a stupid idea. And, the fire chiefs, if they want extra firefighting aircraft and they ask for them, they'll get them, but they haven't asked, which wasn't true because they had a business case gathering dust in Canberra for 18 months, begging for extra money for firefighting aircraft. So, look, extremely frustrating. But I think the government has had to listen to us. And I think we've been successful in getting an ear for the current fire chiefs who weren't being listened to, no matter what this government and the Prime Minister say. They weren't, I know. And I was former head of our peak body for Australia and New Zealand, and we were really nobody in Canberra. It was very difficult to have a voice or be listened to. But they're being listened to now. But it was too little too late. I was fighting fires in Bateman's Bay on New Year's Eve, and there were 114 fires that day in New South Wales. Hundreds and hundreds of homes were lost. I don't know, I think it was 800 odd that day, 600 to 800 just that day. We didn't have enough aircraft. I saw 3 aircraft the whole day. There might have been more, and they were doing a great job, but we needed more. And so belatedly the government said, look, here's all this money. Well, those aircraft still haven't arrived. So
there's just been reports this week, as it's been raining in New South Wales and Victoria, there's aircraft on the way. Wouldn't have been great if it had been there in November and earlier. Do you feel like it would have been materially different if those warnings had been heeded and if there'd been more engagement in the scale of the challenge that we were facing?
I have to say yes, but I say that against the background of knowing that when Mother Nature gets angry and throws extreme weather at you, there's not much that we puny humans can do. And I, as you know, Amanda, I was in California in November at the Kincaid fire up in Sonoma County, and I've worked in California a number of times, but that's firefighter heaven. Any aircraft you want, fire engines. They had 450 fire engines, 4,000 personnel. They had about 120 aircraft on this 37,000 hectare fire. Wow. But they, the winds came up. They had record-breaking hurricane-force winds, and they couldn't pull the fire up, with all that resource. So, so having said that, if the aircraft would have made a difference to saving property, because they don't put fires out, they enable ground crews to get in. They take the intensity out of a fire front so that ground crews can get in and fight the fires. And yes, it would have made a difference. We tried to tell the government getting the military involved in support it's a really difficult process. I've done it, I've been involved in that numerous times over the years for different things overseas and here. But they said, no, we don't need to listen to you. And then guess what? The Prime Minister said, oh, it's a really difficult process and we might have to look at that, after doing it and not telling the Fire Commission in New South Wales or the government that he was doing it. So really frustrating. And yes, it could have made a difference to recovery efforts, to logistics, backing up the firefighters.
So, Greg, let's now take it into some of the questions that have come through online. So we've had a lot of questions wanting some clarity around this issue of hazard reduction. Obviously, in the media, there's been a lot of commentators saying hazard reduction was the issue here. There needed to be more hazard reduction, more land clearing, etc., and that would have made a material difference, rather than climate change being the key driver. Can you tell us how to tackle that question?
Sure. So, look, don't be fooled. These are concerted attempts to take the focus off climate change, because even our Prime Minister now is having to acknowledge, yes, the conditions that made these fires so much worse than they've ever been. And just get it into your head, it's 10 times more homes have been lost than our worst ever fire in the past, and that's 2006. About 5 or 6 times more land burnt than our worst ever fire in the past, 1994.
And that's New South Wales, isn't it?
New South Wales. And we haven't got into the proper fire season in Victoria, Tasmania and South Australia yet, where they have in the past lost thousands of homes. So we've lost 2,176 homes in New South Wales. I hope we don't get a bad season down south, but it's possible. And don't let this little bit of rain fool you either. We could be back in 4 weeks where we were before. So I hate to say that. But look, the fuel reduction question, I said before that the window for hazard reduction has become extremely narrow because it's either too dangerous or we get big downpours and it's too wet. We can't burn. Forest and national parks services have been cut back over the decades or corporatised in the case of forestry. So there's less foresters, rangers out there who can do the work during the week. So it falls to volunteers on weekends, and you hope that the weather on the weekends, conducive to burning. But the other thing is you've got the Royal Commission in 2009, Black Saturday, said, look, there should be hectare targets, and a lot's been made of the Victorian government not meeting the hectare targets. The hectare targets are rubbish. If you burn 10 hectares near 100 homes or 50 homes, that's far better than 10,000 hectares out in the wilderness. So it's very, very easy to get in a plane and drop aerial incendiaries, burn tens of thousands of hectares and meet your targets, and it won't do anything to protect properties. So you have to be very strategic. Look, what brought it home to me from a practitioner's point of view, and I know this stuff, as I said, I was Blue Mountains Hazard Reduction Officer way back when, and have done a lot of hazard reductions over the years, planned them in accordance with fire regimes. When I was fighting fires up near Rapville, we got called a particular place. This was October. And they said there's smoke. Locals said the camp burnt out 2 weeks ago. So we drove out there. We saw this column of brown smoke. So went for kilometres down these dirt tracks. And the fire had gone through underneath the canopies with wind-driven fire, had scorched all the trees, all the leaves on the eucalypts. It was a windy day, so all those dead leaves had come down and a couple of inches thick, or 50 millimetres thick, and a burning stump had set fire to them. So we had about a hectare of leaf litter alight heading towards unburnt country. And 2 weeks later, that fire jumped out again, the same thing. So I've never seen that before. Last week, I was at Wombean Caves, I had 5 fire trucks there I was in charge of, and trying to protect the infrastructure. the fire spotted over a trail, and I had 8 fire trucks and about 40 firefighters working to pull up those spot fires. I ended up having to pull them out. It was about 39 degrees, it was windy. That had been burnt the year before. So it's just bracken, fern and leaf litter and some fallen trees. But with those extreme weather conditions, the fire just raced through there. Now look, the last one, down at Bateman's Bay, I saw metre-high flame, or half-metre high flames, but probably length of flame 3 metres being driven by the wind, going over people's front lawns, closely mown lawns that just had some leaf litter and twigs on them, and then setting fire to homes.
Yeah.
So this was a weather-driven event. It's extreme weather. We've broken so many fire danger index records, with temperature, wind speed, humidity, etc. Over the last few months. It's amazing. Extreme weather is driven by climate change, and so don't let anyone fool you that this is. There's an old lobby comes out every time saying, the fuels were thick. 5 million hectares, it's gone through grassland, scrubland, forest land, stuff that burnt last year, stuff that hasn't burnt for 30 years.
It's gone through the lot, really.
It's gone through the lot, and it'll burn through anything, because when it's dry, tend to dry from 20 years of drying, then you put a drought on top, and then you put extreme weather like we've never experienced before. We get fires like we've never experienced before.
You get those days that are in the upper 40s. It's crazy weather. But I think it was 48 in Penrith.
48.9.
48.9. So moving on from the hazard reduction issue, one of the other things that's coming up, obviously Scott Morrison's been talking about the need for a Bushfire Royal Commission. And I know you've spoken a lot about the other inquiries that have happened over the years. Do you think there's value in doing a Royal Commission now?
Can I go back? You just
you
talked about fuel reduction. The other one that really got on my goat, was it's the arsonists. It's the rotten arsonists. And don't be fooled by that one either. So the figures don't move. They move by about 0.5%, maybe 1% over all my years in fire and rescue, watching those statistics. Yes, arson's a problem. It's a problem everywhere. And as I've said before, if someone works out how to stop that, you'll get the Nobel Prize. That locking up kids who play with matches, or people who, try and backburn for their dope crop or something because they're a dope, that's not going to stop that happening. But it's these fires, about 1% of the area was burned by fires caused by arsonists. Now, most of the fires were caused by lightning. Now, under the Royal Commission, I'm really dubious. The 2009 Royal Commission, there were 2 big Royal Commissions that set the firefighting paradigm in Australia. It was 1939 Stretton Royal Commission, and that said, stay and defend. Bushfires are a part of our natural landscape, and if you're prepared and you know what to do and you can handle the stress and the noise, you should stay and defend your home. We stayed with that for, 70 years. 2009, 173 people lost their lives, which was horrific. 2,029 homes destroyed. We changed the whole paradigm of firefighting in Australia. So we now say certain days, we change the fire danger index to bring in catastrophic, which is off the scale of 1 to 100. Over 100 is catastrophic. We say on those days you must leave early because you will not survive. And if you get on the road, you'll probably be killed. And so, look, those Royal Commissions came up with lots of recommendations. A lot of them have never been implemented. There's been 56 bushfire inquiries over the years, and there's hundreds of recommendations. They need the audit office, who've been busy lately, I see, with sports stuff. So they've shown they can be independent. They should come in and do an audit, a meta-analysis of all these recommendations from the 56 other inquiries and say, what haven't we done yet? What wasn't funded? Because that's what it comes down to, what wasn't funded. And I worry that a Royal Commission, by a jurisdiction that keeps saying it's not our stuff, it's state and territories, so why are they having it in the first place? Maybe it's just to stop this necessary conversation about what actually set the scene for this and why is it so much worse than anything we've ever seen before. Oh, climate change.
just getting onto that issue around the states, there's been a lot of discussion about whose responsibility the fires are, and the federal government for a number of months kept pushing it to say this is state government responsibility. You know, the national response must come from the states asking for that response from the national government. How do you see the federal government's role, particularly in a climate change world?
So they can rely on the Constitution and say emergency management is a state and territory responsibility. And look, usually it is. But when things get out of hand and can't be handled by any one jurisdiction, then it is the role of the national government to come in and support. Now, and my contention is one of the fundamental reasons for being for a national government is to protect its citizenry from external attack or internal attack, in this case internal attack by Mother Nature, because we've prodded her too much. So it's a real cop-out. Now, back in 2003, Prime Minister Howard agreed with the states and territories after Canberra. You'll remember that was one of the ones that everyone went, wow, what is this? This is outside our experience. 503 homes, four people killed, I think, in one terrible afternoon. Agreed with the states and territories. Firefighting assets, big firefighting assets, are a national resource. They're not just for states and territories. We have to have a joined-up approach because the ACT can't afford, they're too small, we can't afford a fleet of firefighting aircraft. Neither can Tasmania, Northern Territory. So let's all get together, increase our purchasing power, dollar for dollar arrangement, a dollar from federal government, dollar from states and territories. Successive governments after that didn't put in any extra money in, so now it's 10 to 1. That's another story. The military have, as we've seen, incredible logistics capabilities, and we were ridiculed. The Prime Minister and others came out and said, soldiers can't fight fires, and you know, you can't use military aircraft for water bombing. That
That's
might
not
be
what you
needed
need them
to
for.
go and kill people. So it's not what we said, although you can use C-130s for water bombing very simply for about $1 million, a roll and roll off system, but that's another story. But they've got all these incredible capabilities in the ADF. They can rebuild bridges, the engineers, they can set up water purification, they can set up tent cities.
They can feed koalas. There was pictures of them nursing koalas.
And so but it's not a role of the ADF. So the next white paper needs to say that our ADF has a civil defence role. So they need to add a role to the military, and that's what we're saying. We need to think long and hard about whether we lease firefighting aircraft from the Northern Hemisphere or whether we have a national fleet. Now, there's certain aircraft they could use for coastal surveillance. It can land on water. They're fantastic firefighting assets as well. So there's all these things that need to be spoken about. Our research capability into the future, how we build homes. Australian Standard 3959 needs to be beefed up. Planning standards for communities. There's areas where we should not build anymore, like flood-prone land. So there's so much for the federal government to do in a coordination sense, and the opposition asked him to call a COAG meeting, and I really worry that the Royal Commission is a way of saying, no, you can't talk about anything like that because it's being looked into.
Where we need to have a more urgent national debate.
This is urgent. New South Wales probably won't have fires like this for maybe only 6 years. So, you know, the last ones were 6 years ago. It used to be you'd get a reprieve of 13 to 21 years, but not anymore. But other states are going to burn because these weather conditions are recurrent. They're going to keep coming back. We need to maintain the rage, if you like.
Yeah.
You know what I mean by maintain the rage. Or keep the government honest and say we must have this debate. We must talk about what caused this.
Let's move into some other questions. We've got, as I said, there was over 200 questions that came in, and those earlier questions around hazard reduction, the Royal Commissions, the things that were really prominent in the media have come up. But there's also some more specific questions around additional issues that are coming up too. So Catherine, I think, summarised this issue quite well. She said, how is Indigenous knowledge of bushfires and fire management being included in the current national response and into policy going forward?
Great question, Catherine. The answer is not very well. So there's been, look, if you go to the Northern Territory, I've done a fair bit of work with Bushfires NT up there, and Indigenous owners maintain their cultural burning practices. There's a lot of work being done in New South Wales, Victoria, people like Victor Stevenson, Oliver Costello, Fire Sticks Alliance. Now, they're trying to bring back practices that were almost forgotten, and they're quite different and they're very complex. So they're not simple. You can't just say to a local rural fire service brigade, go out and burn like Indigenous people burn. You need to actually get traditional owners who understand when flowers bloom, when the birds are nesting, when the wombats are breeding. So that there's certain times of year there's a deep connection to country, and they burn in a different way. It's quite low intensity, but at certain times of the year. So it's very complex. It hasn't been funded. So this needs to be funded by governments so that we can look at protecting assets using that sort of burning. And what they try to do is to replenish country and make it healthy again. And they see some of the burning practices that we do, very intense hazard reductions, trying to get it done in weather conditions when we probably shouldn't burn. They say that damages country. So look, it's part of the conversation, certainly part of what we as emergency leaders for climate action will be pushing the government to do.
And so in that hazard reduction conversation, so I think it's obviously with an issue like that, it could replace some ways of doing hazard reduction and burning, but it wouldn't, in the same way that hazard reduction can't stop these fires, similarly Indigenous burning practices couldn't necessarily have stopped these fires. Is that the case?
Well, it depends who you talk to. So if you talk to the, traditional owners and people who know how to do this, they're saying, well, if we'd been doing it for 50 years, would it have made so we're starting pretty late and the country's pretty damaged. But if you back us up and let us start doing this, you might be surprised at the results in 10 years, 20 years. And so we've got to have a long-term view. Aboriginals had a long-term view over 60,000 years, and in 200 years we came along and stuffed it. So, so I really think they must be part of the conversation and must be part of the effort to how can we do things differently? Because the way we've done things is not going to
it's not
deal with
to the new
what
climate.
we're faced with now.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Greg. The next question is around emissions. Bruce asks us, are the bushfire emissions included in Australia's greenhouse gas reporting? And we had a look into this today, and it is very much still an ongoing issue that hasn't been resolved yet. So there's a range of ways that bushfire smoke gets included into our emissions, and there has been reporting saying it's equivalent currently to our annual emissions. There's still a lot more work to do on that to analyse just how much smoke has gone up into the atmosphere and which fires will be incorporated into our greenhouse gas accounting. So it's not a perfect science in that regard, and certainly some of the emissions that have come out of the bushfires will not be included into our current inventory. That said, the longer term question is more about the rejuvenation of the forest. So often the bushfires are considered, the bushfire burns things down, but then there's rejuvenation in the landscape. Those emissions are then taken up again. But obviously, as Greg said earlier, the landscape is changing in a long-term way. And obviously we've got this long-term drying trend coupled with a drought. So can those forests revegetate to the same extent that they were previously and hold the same level of carbon? Probably not. So those are issues that we will have to continue to grapple with over the next period of time. So thank you, Bruce, for that question. The next one is on climate politics. So Anne asks us, what can be done when federal politicians won't acknowledge your concerns when you go to make them known? Is it better to concentrate pressure on other actors like state governments or local governments?
Yeah, great question, Anne. I'm not sure of the answer to this, but what I have noticed is that the Prime Minister belatedly has actually been ticking boxes of things we asked for in terms of the response to the fires. So a little bit too late, or very late in lots of cases, but actually being forced by public opinion and the media, in my view, and the awareness out there to actually take action. That needs to be replicated with action on climate. So please don't be fooled by all of this talk about adaptation and mitigation. I think we might be talking about that a bit later. It's about emissions reduction and doing our bit in the world for future generations. And so in New South Wales, our Environment Minister, Matt Keane, has been very proactive and has just been slapped down by the Prime Minister today for daring to say that we should do more. And that's great. So in local actions all build up to big actions. All of us can do. We've seen what's happened with rooftop solar, and that's not government policy. That's just us doing stuff. And the practicalities, I mean, my power bill's virtually nothing. I put more back into the grid than I use, and feels good and it's cheap, but it just makes sense. And business are doing that too. So if we can get business involved, industry, local governments, state governments, force our national government to take action. I think that's a great idea. But keep the pressure on. Write to your local MPs, visit them, demand it, because if they're frightened about not getting back into Parliament in the next election, guess what? They'll suddenly grow ears and listen.
Greg, we've got a lot of questions about the long-term impact of the fires, well, both short-term and long-term. Joe McLean on Facebook has asked us about the water quality and soil post-fires. Obviously, we've had reports of some creeks being inundated with ash and other debris and it killing fish. There's concerns about Sydney water supply. What do you think will be some of the concerns that come over the next few months in terms of the water quality?
Yeah, look, particularly with these storms, it'll be interesting after today. I don't know if they went, I think they did go over Camden, so the catchment Lake Burragarang, so the Green Wattle Fire, 300,000 hectares around Warragamba. So that's definitely going to wash a lot of sediment in. You'll get erosion, but the filters, just the filters, it's going to clog up the filters for the drinking water. You've got danger of blue-green algae outbreaks because you've got increased organics and nutrients. So it's a real problem. And this, we saw this in 2009 in Melbourne's catchments. They are able to keep the fires out of the most critical areas, but we've seen it in Los Angeles, around Los Angeles. So it is a major problem where you get these uncontrolled fires coming into catchments that really can affect our drinking water.
Yeah. The next question is around adaptation. You mentioned, Greg, that the Prime Minister has used language recently saying, you know, we need to build our climate resilience and adaptation. Is these fires something that Australia can just adapt to?
No. And I go back to California. So I fought fires in California in 1995, and I've been back there several times. I've studied at the US Fire Academy, got great networks over there. I'm heading back there in March to speak at a conference on climate change and fire. And they can't cope. They used to lose routinely 3,000, 4,000 homes. In 2018, 18,000 homes and 100 dead. In the town of Paradise was wiped off the map. The year before, 9,000 homes. So this is, and I said before, the most resource-rich nation in the world in terms of lots of things, but particularly firefighting resources. That's where we lease our big aircraft. They can't handle it. So we've got two chances, none in Buckley's. This adaptation, we do have to spend money to adapt to make people safer. So in terms of firefighting, there's things we can do, but not on the worst days. We won't save properties. We'll just be trying to save lives. Building stronger infrastructure. When you build back, you must build back stronger, not what you built before. The Sendai disaster reduction framework. It says build back stronger. So we've got to be smart about this. Things like power lines, they should be underground, not up where they can clash together on a windy day and start fires. And that's going to cost billions. So failure to act on climate is really, really expensive. But don't be fooled that it's doable. Just with the power lines, watch them do that. They won't. So we must tackle the root cause.
And of course, this is only 1 degree of warming. And if the rest of the world followed the Australian government's approach to climate change, we'd be heading to 3, 4, even more degree warming by the end of the century. So it's the scale of the challenge would be vastly more than it is now.
And look, if that's the case, maybe there won't be a fire problem in 100 years because everything will be desert, but I don't know where we'll grow our food. And I'm not saying that tongue in cheek. That horrifies me, but that's perhaps the trajectory we're on.
There's another of the questions that are coming in, as I said, around how do we cope with this and how do we adapt into the future. When this question's from Warwick, when the forests regrow, what's the risk that it burns again in the following summer and as our atmosphere continues to change, and how can we mitigate that risk?
I don't know, Warwick. That's what I was talking about, the Hawkesbury region before the state mine fire in 2013, and now the, what do they call it, the Gospers Mountain fire has burnt through the same area again and taken out dozens of homes. So it's just not something that I'd expect. In the Blue Mountains, the fire history was 1939. There were big fires in different areas in 1946, I think maybe 44 as well. The 40s, there were some fires there, but in different spots. 1957, 68, 77, 94, 01. Then all of a sudden, 07, 13, 19. Can you see the problem here? And the same's happening in Tasmania. So 1898, 1933, 1967, 1997, so about 30 years apart. And then what happened? 2006, 2013, hundreds of homes destroyed. 2016, thousands of lightning-caused fires in areas that had never burnt before. Human pines dying because they're not adapted to fire. Great big carbon sinks. 2018, again, hundreds of thousands of hectares burnt. So that's the story. I don't know if the environment can stand this. And the Highland Nature Reserve near Dorrigo, rainforest, the tropical rainforest in Queensland that's burnt. Queensland, the Premier said, is now a bushfire state. They used to get fires, but they never really lost properties. They just lost more properties in 2019 than they've ever lost before. And they're getting fire behaviour that they've just never experienced before. It's so how things regenerate and come back, I don't know if they will.
I think that's the thing that really strikes me is that when I started working on climate change 15 years ago, we were talking about this as very much a future issue, and now it's all around us. And it does require a level of acceptance that some things will just never be the same again, which is extremely sad, but it's the way of what is occurring as a consequence of climate change. And our job really is to minimise the further impacts by tackling the root cause. And I suppose that's where you get into the adaptation versus mitigation. We, of course, need to do some work to make sure that we can cope with the worsening fires. And we've talked about that quite a lot. Emergency leaders has put that forward. But then you can never get away from tackling the root cause of the issue. And that's what we've said so many times. Australia has growing emissions and has for many years now. And it's about turning that around, getting it down rapidly. And as I've sort of pondered these fires, the only good thing that potentially comes out of it is that this could be a wake-up call in Australia and a wake-up call for the world. I've done a number of interviews internationally saying the world should look at this and say, Australia is a very wealthy, developed country, and we can't withstand this. This is a national disaster. So, this is a big wake-up call for everyone.
Yeah, and sorry, I missed the second part of the question there. What can we do about it? And in terms of firefighting resources, etc., yes, we need more. We need some new ideas, but it's not going to stop years like this.
We've got quite a few questions coming in on the what can I do sort of side. So maybe, Greg, you could tell us a little bit about what Emergency Leaders for Climate Action is planning to do and how people can help.
So look, we had a couple of press conferences during the last year. As you'd be aware, we called on the Prime Minister to do certain things. Some of those around response have been done. We called for bringing together of the best brains in Australia to come up with ideas, and like the questions you're asking, bring researchers, Indigenous people, farmers, firefighters, the military, insurance industry, politicians, community leaders together and say, what do we need to do into the future? Try and get some good ideas and come up with national policy position. They wouldn't do that. So we said we will hold a summit. So we're starting to plan that next week. All of the emergency leaders are coming together and Climate Council supporting us in that to work out how we'll run this summit, which will be a big undertaking, and then what we do with the recommendations from that. We're updating now that the fires, as we predicted, they're worse than we predicted. We actually, I'm shocked. I saw it coming. After last year, we nearly got these fires last year, but we had rains in New South Wales, but Victoria, Tasmania, Queensland had serious fires. This was the year. So we're going to update our list of asks, if you like. We'll be like using the military, calling on the government to put that in the next white paper. White papers create the future for the ADF. So periodically they'll write a white paper, and then when it's approved by government, they do that. So they need a civil defence role. They need it in their remit to say this is part of what we do now and integrate more. Emergency management, the Agency for Emergency Management has been gutted and buried in the Home Affairs portfolio. It needs to be brought out, probably married up with the military at Bungendore, the Joint Operations Centre, to give a 24/7 emergency management focus. There's a whole lot of different things, but one of the big issues for us will be lobbying for action on emissions, because all of this will have a small effect, and the net effect of lots of small things can be quite large. But frankly, future generations, if these are the fires we're facing now under 1 degree, imagine under 2 degrees, 3 degrees. We really have that moral obligation to people in the future. We must take major action on emissions. There's no policy setting whatsoever with this government, apart from paying people who say they're going to reduce emissions, which is just ridiculous, and it hasn't worked. The figures show that. So we must fight for this planet, and in every way we possibly can, within reason, non-violently, etc., etc. Taking a leaf out of Gandhi's book, not saying anything else, but we must push our politicians to actually lead. And that's the gulf I see. There's just no leadership here whatsoever.
So I've got a question from Cassie asking, well, what can I do? You're watching online tonight. What would you say to people that are looking at these fires thinking, this is devastating, I'm really scared, I want to do more? What can you do?
Look, firstly, there's a lot of people need support. There's a lot of homeless people. So you said a rich nation, and we've got people living in tents and caravans and displaced. They couldn't get food and water, some of them, for days. So in a nation like ours, this is unbelievable. So think about, if you're donating money, think about the charities that are going directly to people in that space. So I'd be ones that are reputable, like Red Cross, Salvation Army. Be very careful. There's a lot of scams out there. Become a volunteer firefighter. Learn about how you can protect your own home and your community. But think about organisations like Climate Council who are spearheading the fight. And unfortunately, it's a fight. It's political in Australia. It's not in places like England or Germany, old England, it's starting to be. But Germany, people accept the science, accept the need for action. We need to be one of those countries. So there's lots of things that people can do, but put political pressure on. Write letters to the editor, write to your local members, go and see them, tell them you demand action for your protection and protection of your kids and your grandkids.
Now, just to add to that myself, I think that's a really good answer, Greg, but just I often say to people, think about how you use your time, your money and your voice. So thinking about your money, where have you got it invested in your super or in your bank account? Is it going towards making the problem better or the problem worse? There are now a lot of institutions that are thinking about how they make investments in renewable energy and other things that are beneficial for the climate rather than fossil fuels, for instance. It's also using your money to support organisations, as Greg said. There's been a lot of support going into frontline organisations, which has been really important, helping people and animals that are affected directly by the fires now. But I think as we go forward from this point, the philanthropic spirit in Australia needs to do more to support organisations that are doing that advocacy work on climate change. There's about $50 million a year that goes into all of the charities that are working on climate change work. That's about equivalent to building a public swimming pool. It's a bit of a drop in the ocean across in terms of our wealth in Australia, and there could be much more going into climate advocacy, which would inevitably have a big impact. So that's money. How do you use your time? I think there will be a lot of opportunities for volunteering. There's organisations like Parents for Climate Action, for instance, or Climate for Change. Lots of groups out there that are engaging people to educate their community, get people involved. There will be lots of protests like the student strikes that happened at the start and the end of last year that were really effective in putting the issue on the national agenda. There'll be lots of opportunities to use your time, but I often tell people, think about the sphere of influence around you. So if you're working in a business, how can that business start tackling the climate crisis by moving to more renewable energy, for instance? And thinking, so it's not just about what you do individually at home in terms of recycling or using less light, it's like, or less electricity. How do you work within the connections you have, so your children's school or your university or your workplace, to help come together and be tackling the climate crisis? I think we need lots of demonstrations of it's possible, it's happening, like let's show how that's all going on. And then of course using your voice. So Greg mentioned writing to MPs. Sometimes that can feel a bit disempowering because you get those letters back that are sort of stock standard saying, thanks for your inquiry, we're doing a lot on this already. But I don't think we should underestimate how important it is for our local members to be consistently hearing from their constituents that this is a really big issue. We've, over the last few couple of months, there's been a spike in people's concern, and that's been replicated in the amount of letters and correspondence going to MPs. And we are seeing some movement in the coalition. You would see today, as Greg said, Matt Keane in New South Wales, the Environment Minister has been much more vocal on climate change. There's a range of federal MPs like the Science Minister and others who've been more vocal on climate change. And it seems like there is some movement in the federal coalition. That said, we can't just depend on the federal government to solve it. They haven't given us any indication that they will solve the problem. So it's critical that we're advocating to all levels of government, local, state governments, as well as encouraging businesses, community groups to be tackling the problem as well. So there are things that we can all do, whether it's transitioning to more renewable energy as an obvious one. That's getting down, if we're all doing that together, that's about getting down Australia's emissions. And one thing that gives me hope, in fact, is that state governments, almost all of them now have a net zero pollution target by 2050, and most of them have renewable energy targets. So on a de facto basis, we almost have those targets as a nation, even though we haven't seen that leadership from the federal government. So there's a lot to do, and it's really about finding a way that you can make a difference. And I know many people probably feel like watching this scale of crisis, like, is there anything I can do? I feel pretty small. But there is something for us all to do, particularly if we're working together. And essentially there's no other choice. We can't let it continue to get worse and worse. Someone's just said, Andrew Collins has just said, it feels like I've been banging my head against a brick wall. And, you know, we feel a bit like
Welcome.
that sometimes, don't we, Greg?
Hurts, doesn't it?
But I think...
You just keep on banging.
Yeah, we've just got to keep on banging our heads, and we can't let this crisis go without a huge change in Australia. By hook or by crook, we're going to make it happen. So that's all we've got time for today. We're heading up to 7:30. Greg, thank you so much for your time. Thanks, and all your leadership.
Thanks, everybody.
And thank you for being part of the webinar. And if you liked it, give us some feedback, and we can do it. We can do these sorts of things another time. But thank you for being with us and supporting the Climate Council. See you later.